Well, now you may ask, have we finished with the issue of the validity of the senses? Not yet. There is a final crucial question I must raise. And that question can best be put: what is the metaphysical status of the sensory qualities we perceive? What is the metaphysical status of the sensory qualities we perceive? To make the issue clear in its crudest terms, if you discuss the senses with anybody, with many people I should say, you will commonly be asked, where are the qualities you perceive or experience? Where, for instance, is color, warmth, solidity, heat, size, shape, etc.? Are they only in here, in the mind, only subjective? Or are they out there, in reality, intrinsic in things, part of things in themselves? The subjective idealists, like Bishop Berkeley, say all sensory qualities are subjective. They're all in the mind. The typical naive realist today says all sensory qualities are intrinsic in the objects in reality. And then the Descartes-Locke axis, which is usually called critical realism. They are kind of the Republicans or compromisers of sense theory. They say there's two kinds of sensory qualities: the primaries, extension, including size, shape, etc., which are intrinsic in things in reality, and the secondaries, color, sound, smells, taste, etc., which are subjective, existing only in the mind. Now, the point I want to make is that objectivism disagrees with all three of these theories. Now, before criticizing them, I want first to develop the objectivist viewpoint on this issue, as defined by Ayn Rand, and which she has communicated to me in a lengthy series of discussions. Then, after presenting the objectivist view, we can turn briefly in conclusion to criticize these theories. Now, the first point to note is that sensation is the product of an interaction, a physical, physiological interaction between two entities: the physical object and the relevant sense organs of the perceiver. Each of these entities is essential to the end product, which is the sensation. Without the physical object, there is nothing to perceive, i.e., no sensation. Without the sense organs, there is no means of perception, i.e., no sensation. The process of sensation is a process of physical interaction between two entities in reality. Now, if you think about this, you will see that it immediately invalidates any question which asks, where is the sensation or the sensory quality? There is no answer to this question because the question is invalid. You cannot ask such a question about anything which is the product of a physical interaction. Now, take a simple example of first having nothing to do with the senses at all. An Oldsmobile and a Cadillac collide. Now, a collision is a type of interaction between the two cars. Does it make sense for me to ask, where is the collision? Is it in the Oldsmobile? Is it in the Cadillac? In the ashtrays, under the seat covers? Now, all of these answers are senseless because the question is senseless. The collision designates a relationship between the two entities and cannot be declared to be in one as against in the other. In one sense, it is in neither. It is a process in which both partake, but which is not a thing located in either one by itself. In another sense, the collision is in both, because it is a process in which both partake. Or take another example, this time involving the senses. I play a phonograph record of a Viennese operetta, which I listen to. And now I ask you, where is the operetta? Is it in the record? Is it in my ears? Is it in my brain? Is it in my mind? Now, these are clearly foolish questions, because the answer to all of them is yes and no, depending upon the aspect in question. The operetta is in the record, in the sense that the record is so structured that when a certain needle moves over its surface in a certain way, a human perceiver will hear the music. But the operetta is not in the record all by itself, as though some kind of submicroscopic soprano were nestling between the grooves, belting out tiny notes to herself. And the same is true for the ears. Is the operetta in your ears? If so, where? The outer ear, the middle ear, or the inner ear? Is it in your brain? Is it in your mind? Well, in one sense, obviously, no. When you listen to the operetta, you are not humming subvocally to yourself. You are not just imagining or hallucinating. You are hearing an event in reality. It is not just, quote, in your mind. In another sense, obviously the operetta is in your mind, in the sense that if no one were conscious, the record could spin forever and no one would hear any sounds. So where is the operetta? In the record? In the air vibrations? In the ear twitches? In the nerve cells? In the brain's gray matter? In the consciousness? The answer is all of these and or none. The question is invalid. Now, the same principle applies in regard to all sense experiences. Since they are the product of a physical interaction between entities in reality, it is a fundamental error to ask, where are the sense qualities? In the object out there or in the mind in here? The answer, as in the previous case, is both or neither. In other words, the question is invalid. What you can say is only two incontestable facts. One, without consciousness, no sensations. In other words, no conscious states would exist. States of consciousness are states of consciousness and would not exist without consciousness. In this sense, if there were no perceiving beings, there would be no perceptions, no sensations. And secondly, just as obvious and just as important, consciousness is consciousness of something, of an object in reality. And without the something, without the object, there would be no sensations or perceptions either. The sensation or perception is not an invention of consciousness, it is a form of awareness of the object. Now this brings me to the next point. As a form of awareness, sensation is a cognitive process. By means of this physical interaction of object and sense organ, man gains information, real information, an enormous amount of information about the facts of reality. A sensation is not a subjective effect divorced from the object. It is not a creation of consciousness which has nothing to do with the object. On the contrary, the precise nature of your sensation is a result of the total properties of the object in question and a lead to the ultimate conceptual discovery of these properties. You can, in this respect, think of man's senses as entities which operate to sum up, that is the key term here, to sum up an enormous range of facts about the object in reality being sensed, to give you a whole body of information condensed in the form of a single sensation. All of science, in fact, is nothing more than the unraveling, in other words, the conceptual identifying of the information summed up implicitly in our sensations. For instance, you open your eyes and see that an ashtray is red. Here, in the form of a single sensation of redness, you receive a vast amount of information about the object, although you must rise to the conceptual scientific level to be able to identify this information. What is it about the object that is in fact indicated by the perception of it as red? That it is an object which absorbs certain kinds of light waves and fails to absorb others. That to do so it has to have a certain kind of surface structure. That this involves a certain kind of physical chemical constitution on its part, etc., etc. If it's an apple that's red, the red indicates in addition that the apple is ripe, i.e. that it's undergone a certain biological development, has reached a certain stage of maturity, with everything this implies. So far from it being true that redness is merely a subjective state of consciousness divorced from reality, redness, of course I've given you just the sketchiest beginnings of a few examples, redness is actually a summary in the form of a single sensation of a whole host of properties possessed by the objects in reality. Now, it is not, of course, necessary that every perceiver in the universe gain this information in the form of a red sensation. There could be, as we have seen, different forms of perception, different kinds of sensation as a result of the interaction of the object with different kinds of senses. But the cognitive point here remains unaffected by this. Whatever the form of the sensation, our sensations summarize a host of facts about the entity in reality. They are the product of the total entity in reality, and all of science is the unraveling of the information they implicitly contain. Now, this cognitive role is true, by the way, of every sensation. Consider the case of the tickle. Now, you recall that advocates of the primary-secondary quality distinction love to compare the so-called secondary qualities to the tickle you get from a feather. The tickle, they say, is simply subjective. It tells you nothing about the feather. It's merely the subjective effect in you. In fact, this is completely false. The tickle gives you definite information about the feather. It summarizes in the form of a single sensation a whole body of information about the properties, structure, texture, etc. of the feather. If you doubt this, a simple experiment will show it to you. Try drawing a variety of different objects across your body, and you will get a different summary from your sensations, revealing to you the nature of radically different objects. Draw a rose thorn across your arm, and you will not get a tickle, but a scratch. Does this indicate something about the nature of the red thorn in reality as against the feather? Does it give you information about a real fact of reality? Try drawing the edge of a razor blade across your skin, and you will not get a tickle or a scratch, but a sharp cut. Try drawing a pipette dripping sulfuric acid across your skin, and you will get neither a tickle nor a scratch nor a cut, but a searing agony. In all these cases, you are gaining information about the entity. You are perceiving a whole range of facts about the entity, summed up in the different cases in the form of different sensations. Are the sensations then just inventions or products of consciousness, divorced from facts of existence, not indicative of facts of existence? Obviously no. They are cognitive elements. And if this is true of a tickle, which is the bastion of the secondary quality people, it is obviously equally true of all the so-called secondary qualities. They are not independent of the objects which produce them. They are not simply non-cognitive, subjective effects on us in here. They are objective indicators in a certain form of what is out there. Now, of course, from having one sensation, you cannot acquire all of the knowledge implicitly summed up by that sensation. If I stick a knife in a baby and he feels the pain, he has only a single and to him inexplicable sensation, and so far has not learned any facts about the knife. He merely feels the subjective effect of the knife on him. So long as we are on the most primitive level of consciousness, the level of being bombarded with single sensations, so long as we do nothing cognitively with them, then to that extent, the sensation is simply a feeling in consciousness which generates no information about the entities in reality. What must the baby do to begin unraveling, actually acquiring the information implicit in his sensation of pain? He must utilize all of his senses in relation to the knife. He must look at it and observe its shape, finger it and observe its sharp edge, pick it up and feel its solidity, drop it, and hear the thud it makes on falling, etc., etc. After such a sensory survey, appropriately performed, the brain of the baby, and this point we mentioned last week, learns to integrate all these separate sensations into an entity. And the baby rises to the perceptual level, where he is aware not merely of separate sensations, but of integrated percepts. In other words, integrated material entities. At this stage, he is in a position to grasp at least part of the information initially implicit in the sensation of pain. The knife causes him pain he can grasp because it is solid and sharp, as against the feather, which is very different in texture and structure. At this point, on a primitive level, by means of having integrated his sensations into an entity, the baby can begin to unravel the information given by his separate sensations and grasp what about the entity caused those sensations. A separate sensation by itself does not directly give him information about the object. By itself, it is simply a feeling in consciousness. But when he has integrated it with all the rest of the sensory data from the object, the individual rises to the level where he can grasp entities and thus be in a position to begin extracting from his sensations the information they contain implicitly. Those who declare as a formal theory in epistemology that sensations are simply subjective feelings, subjective effects, which are devoid of information about reality, are thus ascribing to mankind as a whole the cognitive primitiveness of a newborn baby. Their epistemological model of man is he possesses only the knowledge available to a newborn infant who has not yet risen to the perceptual level. The infant, they declare, in effect, gets only subjective effects from his sensations, no information about reality. Therefore, neither does man, the adult man who has integrated his sensations and reached the perceptual level. And of course, beyond the perceptual level is the conceptual, the distinctively human level, the level on which scientific explanation becomes possible. Once that level is reached, man can begin to define explicitly the information about the knife implicit in his sensations and only partly accessible even on the perceptual level. Now he can enter into an analysis of the knife's structure and density and the nature of the body's receptors and nerves and so on and so on. In other words, the kind of analysis required fully to grasp the causes of the sensation of pain, the facts about the knife which make it a source of pain as against a feather. But the conceptual level, as you know, is a development from the perceptual, which is in turn an integration of the sensational stage. The point is, the information reached explicitly on the conceptual level was there, in the sensational stage, implicitly contained and summed up in our sensations. If it were not there, we could never have risen to the conceptual level. So much for the idea that the so-called secondary qualities are simply subjective sensory effects in the mind, devoid of cognitive significance in relation to objects. Now, having said all this, have we now satisfied the advocates of the so-called secondary qualities? Have we now satisfied them that color, sound, etc. are real and not subjective? You might think so, but the answer is still no. At this point, they will argue as follows. And let us take red as the example of all such secondary, so-called secondary sense qualities. Red, they will say, is not an intrinsic quality of things in themselves. They will say, after all, you yourself admit that red is an effect on human consciousness of what exists out there in reality. So redness, they conclude, is not a quality of things in themselves. It is merely an effect. It is produced by more basic factors in reality, light waves and so on, operating on your sense organs. That's the argument we want to turn to now. You got it? Now follow the implications of this argument as Ayn Rand pointed them out to me. Red is declared to be not an attribute of things in themselves because it is not a causal primary. In other words, an irreducible fact without any deeper cause underlying it. Because our perception of redness has a cause involving both the object in reality and our sense organs. For that reason, redness is disbarred from the status of a real attribute of things in themselves. So by this standard, the only facts that qualify as attributes of things in themselves are causal primaries. In other words, attributes which cannot be explained by reference to anything more fundamental, attributes which are irreducible, ultimate facts of reality, which are not in any way the product of deeper causes. Now I ask you, if being a causal primary in this sense is the standard of being really real, how are we to tell what is a causal primary and what is not? At one point in human knowledge, people did think redness was a causal primary. They thought that redness was simply an intrinsic property of things without any underlying cause. And then it was discovered that light waves and so on underlie red, and that red is an effect on our sense organs of light waves. Well, are light waves causal primaries? Are they irreducible facts of reality without deeper explanation? Obviously not. According to the latest theories, light waves themselves are effects, expressions of various energy and or particle combinations. Is energy, is subatomic particles a causal primary? The point is, how would you know? Only one way. You would have to know every attribute of matter, every constituent of physical reality, in order to be able to say, I have surveyed the totality. I know everything there is to know about the physical world, and thus I see that X, whatever it is the ultimate ingredient, the basic cause of everything else, the real constituent out of which everything else is made, in which everything else reflects. You would have to be omniscient, literally omniscient, to grasp that this X is the ultimate unit and cause of every other phenomenon in reality. To declare that only causal primaries qualify as real attributes of reality is to declare man can never claim any of his knowledge as knowledge of reality, in other words, as knowledge until he is omniscient, which means he can know nothing until he knows everything. Well, if so, how is he supposed to get to the stage of knowing everything? To deny redness the status of reality on the ground that it is an effect of deeper causes, to denounce man's senses because they only provide us with effects, is to declare, I won't accept the validity of the senses unless what they give us is the causal primaries of reality, the ultimate elements or attributes which underlie everything else, the irreducible building blocks of the universe. I demand that the senses give me ultimate causes, not effects. And since they give me effects, they are invalid. That's the meaning of the claim. Now, this is a classic example of what Ayn Rand calls the fallacy of rewriting reality. The fact is, reality does not give us, by perception, reality does not give us the ultimate causal primaries of existence. It gives us effects, qualities which are real, but which are the products of complex underlying causes acting on our senses, causes which modern science is nowhere yet near unraveling completely. By what logical right does an individual stamp his foot in a petulant state and declare, if I had created reality, we would have been given the ultimate causes by direct perception. Since we're not given them and only effects, our senses are no good and knowledge is impossible, and I leave. Now, this is obviously a grotesque departure from reality and a grotesque standard by which to judge the senses. But let us follow this construct up for a few minutes, because it will be clarifying in regard to several points. To begin with, if redness is an effect, and therefore not intrinsic in things in themselves, this obviously applies to anything which can be causally explained in like manner. It applies to sound, temperatures, textures, etc. What about extension itself, that bastion of the Cartesians and the Lockeans? Is extension a causal primary? Is three-dimensional extension in space, with its correlates of size, shape, solidity, etc., a causal primary in the sense I earlier defined? At our present state of knowledge, we cannot say. There may very well be deeper causes in reality, ultimate factors making up reality, which take on the form of extended objects when perceived by man, just as they take on the form of red, green, hot, cold, etc. objects. As Bishop Berkeley pointed out, and in this one respect he is correct, there is no presently known standard by which to distinguish metaphysically between the status of the extension qualities and the colors, smells, etc. They are all in the same metaphysical boat. Now, I want to be clear here. I do not mean to imply that I know that extension is not a causal primary. The point is, you would have to be omniscient to know one way or the other. The point is, at the present stage of human knowledge, it is entirely arbitrary to draw a line and declare red is an effect, but extension is irreducible and intrinsic in reality. That is simply arbitrary at this stage of knowledge. So I want, for pedagogical purposes, to take a bold leap. Let us assume that extension, and that means therefore size and shape and so on, is an effect, in the same manner as red, green, hot, cold, etc. Let us assume that the entire world of matter, as we perceive it, is an effect produced by the operation on our sensory apparatus of the ultimate causal primaries which make up reality in itself. Let us assume we have discovered the actual causal primaries in reality, the ultimate elements of things in themselves, the basic irreducible building blocks of reality in itself, which underlie and give rise to everything that we perceive, to the entire physical world as we know it. Now, what these ultimate primaries are, I of course do not pretend to know. For purposes of this construct, let us call them puffs of meta-energy. Now, I deliberately choose something esoteric and undefined without pretending at all to know what it means. Let us assume in sum that we have reached omniscience, penetrated to the core of reality in itself, and discovered that things in themselves are puffs of meta-energy, and that what we perceive as a material world of three-dimensional objects with color, shape, size, etc. is all an effect on us of various combinations of energy puffs acting on our means of perception. So things in themselves are really combinations of various energy puffs. Suppose now this whole construct were true. The crucial question is, what would it prove about the validity of the senses or the status of the sensory qualities we perceive? And the answer is nothing of any epistemological significance whatever. The point here is this: if everything is made of energy puffs in various combinations, so are human beings. And it is still an iron, inescapable fact of reality that when the energy puffs which comprise external reality interact with the energy puffs which comprise human beings, when all of these puffs enter into all of the combinations that they enter into, the inexorable result is the material world as we perceive it, with all of the kinds of entities and qualities it possesses. This is a fact of reality, not a creation of consciousness. It is a fact that when such and such energy puffs unite in such and such a combination with other ones, the result is a man with all his properties, or an orange, or a buffalo, or a planet, or a feather, etc. So whenever we perceive one of these material objects, we are perceiving reality. In other words, energy puffs in a certain combination. And every sense perception gives us real information about that particular combination of energy puffs. Does it mean that extension, size, shape, color, etc. are unreal just because they are effects of the energy puffs in certain combinations? Certainly not. The exact opposite is true. If they are effects of the energy puffs, by that very fact they are real. Real products of the real puffs which make up reality. We did not invent the puffs. We did not invent their capacity to unite into forms which bring about a material extended world. We did not create the physical world by any subjective act of our consciousness. It is a metaphysical fact of reality that certain puffs in certain combinations produce, when perceived by a human being, an extended physical world. And that every sense perception we have gives us information about the puff combinations that exist. It is an intrinsic fact of things in themselves that X puffs combined with Y puffs combined with Z puffs, man's senses, yield solid, three-dimensional extended objects. Now on this account, if we pursue it, the whole material world would be an effect of things in themselves acting on the puffs which make us up and constitute our sensory apparatus. But the point is, the material world would be an effect, a real effect, and therefore a real fact. You do not deny the reality of something by explaining it. You do not make something subjective by giving a causal explanation of it. You do not detach it from reality by showing that something in reality produced it. The exact opposite is true. If you have shown that the cause of something exists in reality, if you have shown that reality itself in itself produced certain facts, then you have given the most solid metaphysical foundation there is to those facts. You have shown that they are inherent in metaphysical reality itself. In a word, if the whole construct I have given you were true, it would change nothing about the validity of the senses or the reality status of the sensory qualities we perceive. In this manner, all of the sensory qualities we perceive are inherent in reality, in things in themselves. They are real. They are not human inventions or subjective products of consciousness. Now you can see why objectivism rejects the primary-secondary quality distinction. It is not true that extension is really out there intrinsically, and color and the rest are really just subjective effects on us. All the qualities we perceive are facts of independent reality as perceived by human consciousness. There is no grounds whatever to divide the properties we perceive up into the extension-connected ones versus the color, sounds, textures, etc. There is no warrant for proclaiming two kinds of sensory properties, those which belong to the object versus those which are created by consciousness. The actual facts are there are objects in independent reality which have various attributes in themselves. Human beings have the faculty of consciousness and perceive those objects by certain means, and thus in certain forms. forms inexorably dictated and determined by the nature of the objects in themselves, part of which includes the nature of man's sensory apparatus. Now, the only valid distinction you can make in this context is between the primary causes in reality, the energy puffs in my construct, and the derivative manifestations of those puffs. All of their expressions, effects, results. You can distinguish between cause and effect in this way, but that is not the distinction between primary and secondary qualities as the traditional philosophers make it. Now, here you have to be precise about the meaning of terms. If the phrase primary quality means quality intrinsic in reality, in other words, quality which is a real fact as against a subjective product of consciousness, then, as we have seen, all the qualities we perceive are facts, all are real, all are primary, red and green as much as size and shape. On the other hand, if by primary quality you mean exists in the objects which are irreducible primaries in reality, the objects in themselves apart from their effects, combinations, and interactions, then none of the qualities we perceive are primary in that sense. In either event, the traditional primary-secondary quality distinction collapses. There is no ground to assume that the causal primaries in reality possess in themselves the exact same form as our sense data, since we know that our sense data are effects and that we perceive by certain means. But by the same token, you cannot pronounce our sense data as invalid on this ground. It is only by starting from our sense data that we can ultimately conceptually unravel the information they contain and finally end up with a conceptual account of the energy puffs or whatever it is we reach at the summit of the cognitive quest. Now you can see also why objectivism denies not only Bishop Berkeley's subjective idealism or the whole primary-secondary quality viewpoint, but also naive realism. What the naive realist does, in effect, is to treat all the qualities we perceive as causal primaries, intrinsic in objects independent of man's form of perception. He doesn't explain the facts of man's perception. He takes no account of the fact that men perceive in a certain form, that consciousness requires means of consciousness, that the properties we perceive are the product of an interaction between the objects in reality and our sensory apparatus. And as a result, as soon as the naive realist confronts the fact of two perceivers perceiving the same object in different forms, for instance, the colorblind versus the normal-sighted person, the naive realist is lost and falls back to the claim that one of their senses must be deceptive. And as soon as science offers a causal explanation of some quality that we perceive, the naive realist is also lost and feels that it threatens the reality of the quality he perceives. In short, naive realism is properly named. It is naive. Its basic intention to preserve the validity of human consciousness is correct. If you want to put it this way, its heart is in the right place. But it has no means to implement or defend this intention, or to support or justify its claim that man's senses reveal reality. Objectivism is not naive realism. It is not so-called critical realism. It is not subjective idealism. It is objectivism. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us now turn to the problem of the borderline case, which, as you know, is one of the chief arguments put forth by modern philosophers to defend their nominalist theory of universals. A full answer to this question would require that I offer you now a presentation of the objectivist theory of concepts and contrast it to the Platonist, Aristotelian, and nominalist theories. I will not attempt such a presentation this evening. I'm assuming, if you're interested in this issue, that you have already read and understood Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, that you understand the objectivist view of the nature and formation of concepts, because there is a limit to what can be done in 3 hours, and above all, of why concepts are neither intrinsic in the Platonist or Aristotelian manner or subjective in the nominalist manner, but rather objective. If you understand this much, you will not have any difficulty with the borderline case question, and indeed that issue is referred to in Miss Rand's book. Now, the borderline case argument, as we have seen, is one of the basic arguments used by nominalists to justify their claim that there is no objective method to determine where to draw the lines when one is grouping concretes together in the process of concept formation. A typical example of the argument, for instance, as we discussed in the course, is where do you draw the line between red and orange? Are the intermediate shades red or orange or neither? Isn't any decision arbitrary and subjective? What has reality to say on this question? Or to give you a new example, just for variety, someone invents an object which is just like a table in all respects. It's a manufactured object. It has a flat level surface for holding other objects, but it attaches to the ceiling and hangs from it by chains. And then the nominalist comes in and asks you, well, is it a table or not? How would you decide? In some respects, it's very much like tables, as we originally defined them: manufactured objects, flat level surface with supports to hold other objects, and so on. In certain ways, it's obviously different. How different can it be from our original conception of tables and still qualify? Where do you draw the line? Isn't it, asks the nominalist, all arbitrary and subjective? Now, there are endless examples of this order. Let us first pose and answer the question in general terms, and then apply the answer to these examples. The problem in its most general form may be posed as follows. We classify concretes on the basis of similarities and differences. But the concretes in a given class will differ in various ways from each other, and will be similar in various ways to concretes in other classes. By what standard, then, do we draw the line? Or, as it's more usually put, we have, let us say, formed some class, some concept, on the basis of similarities that we have detected among a given set of concretes, and we have defined the concept accordingly. Then we discover a new concrete, which is in some respects like the members of the original class, and in some respects different. How do we decide what to do with this new concrete? Should we put it in the original class, which may involve broadening and redefining the original class? Or should we form a new concept for the new concrete to distinguish it from the concretes already conceptualized? Or is there another alternative still, and if so, what is it? Now, the answer in general is determined by the function of concept formation in human knowledge. Concepts, according to objectivism, are integrations of percepts. They enable us to isolate a set of concretes, which we can then treat as a unit for specialized study. Whether or not to form a new concept, therefore, to encompass some newly encountered concrete, depends upon the degree or extent of the differences separating the new concretes from the others we know. It depends upon whether the differences in question are fundamental or not. When the differences are significant or fundamental enough so that it is no longer practicable to study the new concretes in terms of one's concepts to date, and when the phenomenon is widespread enough so that one has to deal with it, then one coins a new concept. Now, observe that there is no way of specifying in numerical terms how great a difference qualifies as significant or fundamental. In this respect, there is an optional element in the formation of new concepts. In some cases, the formation of a new concept to cover in newly discovered concrete is mandatory. In other cases, it is invalid and impermissible to form a new concept. And in other cases, it is optional. Now I want to illustrate for you these three types of situation. And first of all, the mandatory case. Now I ask you here to recall at the outset Ms. Rand's point that definitions are contextual. The function of a definition is to distinguish, in terms of fundamentals, the existence in a certain class from all others known at a given stage of knowledge. Definitions depend upon the context of knowledge because the characteristics which serve to differentiate one group of concretes from the rest depend in part on the nature of the concretes, in part on the context of one's knowledge. If you recall Ms. Rand's example of the child's initial implicit definition of man as a thing that moves and makes sounds. Within his knowledge, not yet having discovered and discriminated various animals, automobiles, etc., grasping at this point, let us say, only the distinction between inert and silent objects, like chairs and tables, and the people around him, he may select moving and making sounds as the characteristic differentiating men from all the other objects he knows. As such, he has, within the context of his knowledge, successfully isolated men from the rest of what is known to him. To that extent, his definition is correct. It is contextually valid. Now, let's foreshorten a complex process to get back to the borderline case from this takeoff point. Let's assume now that the child discovers locomotives and landslides. At this point, it is mandatory for him to form a new concept, actually concepts, to cover the new phenomena, and mandatory to redefine man so as to keep that concept separated from his new discoveries. If he tried not to form a new concept, to include locomotives, landslides, and men under one concept, with one name, to treat them as a unit in his further dealings with and study of them, he would find himself defeated in his attempts to expand his knowledge, and defeated by virtue of the fact of there being just too many profound differences in reality among the things he is attempting to deal with as a single class. He would find that some, quote, men talk while others hiss and rumble. That some, quote, men walk on legs while others roll on wheels. That in some their characteristics, structure, components, behavior are radically different, and thus that virtually nothing learned about some so-called men would be applicable to others. To keep track of his knowledge, it would be necessary, in spite of himself, to distinguish, for instance, the talking men from the rolling men, and so on, which means he would be forced, if he is rational, to form separate concepts for the entities he had lumped together. In this kind of case, in some, the differences are simply too fundamental and far-reaching. And this is the type of case in which it is mandatory to form new concepts to cover a newly encountered concrete. Now look at the impermissible case. Start again with the child in the above example, with the same initial definition of man as the thing which moves and makes sounds, and assume that he has so far seen only white men, and now encounters Negroes for the first time, and decides to erect a new class, so that there are now men and Negroes as two separate concepts. Now here is the opposite error, taking an insignificant difference as the basis for forming a distinct concept. And again, the child would find that the facts of reality would force him to alter his concepts here, because the color in this case affects virtually nothing about the entities involved. It is a non-significant, non-fundamental characteristic. Whether a given shade of color is present or absent, hosts of characteristics will remain similar in the two allegedly different classes he has formed. If he sets out to study men and then Negroes, he will find that virtually everything he learns about the one in anatomy, psychology, physiology, etc., is true also of the other, so that the distinction he has erected is in fact useless in enabling him to organize his field of knowledge. Now, this does not mean that one cannot subdivide the concept man according to various special characteristics by means of specific concepts, such as Negro, Caucasian, etc. It does mean, however, that such concepts must be recognized as subdivisions of one broader class, and that as such they all share crucial characteristics which require being conceptualized together into one unit, namely the concept man. Now turn to the optional case. Imagine, finally, that having formed a given concept, you encounter a concrete which is neither crucially different, the way locomotives and landslides are from men, nor crucially similar, the way black and white men are, but somewhere in between. And here we can use the hanging table as an example. Now, in this type of case, precisely because the nature of the concrete neither demands a new concept nor forbids one, one's procedure is optional. You have three choices in this specific type of case. 1. Since its purpose and general structure are the same as tables, except for its being attached to the ceiling rather than the floor, you might decide to include it under the class of tables, which will then require an appropriate alteration in your initial definition of table on the usual pattern of contextual redefinition. And if necessary, you may then decide to subdivide tables into two species, floor tables and ceiling tables, and even give separate names to the two types. That's one possibility. Or second, since its construction will involve a number of differences from tables. For instance, you can't normally use this hanging table outdoors. It requires some specific means of being attached to the ceiling. It's not easily movable, etc. You may decide to form a new concept to designate this type of entity, treating it thus as a concept on a level with tables rather than as a type of table. That's a second possibility. Or thirdly, you need do neither of these two things. You need not have any one concept to designate such an entity. You need not either subsume it under the old concept nor make up a new one, but merely identify its status as intermediate by means of a descriptive phrase. Entity, like tables in such and such a way, and unlike them in such and such a way. Now, please note this fact. It is not the case that every phenomenon must ultimately be subsumable under one concept. There are phenomena which can be handled cognitively, fully adequately, by a description formulated in terms of a number of other concepts. Phenomena which do not require the formation of a single concept to cover them, not now or ever. Now, for shorthand, I will refer to this as the descriptive handling of certain concretes, as distinct from the conceptual handling of them. But you understand, I trust, that the description will be in terms of concepts already formed. The point of the distinction is only that no single concept need be formed to handle such phenomena. In other words, we do not form for everything in the universe a single concept, a single word to cover it. All sorts of phenomena are handled descriptively in terms of a number of other concepts. Indeed, all conversation and writing are descriptive in this present sense. For instance, if I say, "It is a beautiful winter evening. The air is crisp and the sun is setting with a golden glow," I have used a whole series of concepts, beautiful winter evening, sun, glow, etc., to identify and communicate a certain phenomenon. There is no single concept to stand for beautiful winter evenings with crisp air and golden sunsets, nor is there any need for such a single concept. The descriptive handling serves all cognitive purposes perfectly satisfactorily. When you have a case such as the, quote, hanging table, therefore, there is nothing to say that you must have one concept to identify it, either an old one or a new one specifically formed for it. it is optional in such a case whether to handle it conceptually or descriptively. Now, the fact that in cases like the hanging table, objectivism recognizes a number of optional alternatives, including the possibility of descriptive handling, this fact clearly differentiates objectivism from the traditional realists in the theory of universals like Plato and like Aristotle. Now, on that traditional realist view, whether Platonist or Aristotelian, essences are intrinsic in things. For the traditional realists, each entity has an essence intrinsic to it, and we've seen that in this course. An essence apart altogether from any relation to man's knowledge or man's mode of cognition. So, for instance, tablehood, or tableness, if we call it that, is a phenomenon that inhabits all tables intrinsically on the traditional view. It's present in all tables, absent in everything else, and given any concrete, it either has the essence in itself or it doesn't have the essence in itself. And consequently, there can be no options. No option, for instance, in the case of the hanging table. Either it has the intrinsic essence of tableness in it, in which case it must be subsumed under the concept table, or it doesn't have it, but has instead a different intrinsic essence, in which case it must be subsumed under some single new concept naming that essence. In either case, there can be no option and no possibility of descriptive handling. Consequently, Platonists and Aristotelians alike find the borderline case examples a serious embarrassment, because they have no means of deciding in such cases which entities have which intrinsic essences. And ultimately, if you press them far enough, they have to rely on, quote, intuition, which of course means their theory ends up being subjective in spite of themselves. It is the defenders of intrinsic essences who find the borderline case problem difficult or impossible to answer. But now the objectivist theory is that essences are objective, not intrinsic, and therefore there is no such problem. Concepts, according to objectivism, are human forms of cognition, forms of organizing our perceptual material for the sake of enabling us to expand our knowledge beyond the perceptual level. Essences, according to objectivism, are characteristics contextually determined, which serve to differentiate our concepts. Now, there is nothing in this to say that every concrete must at some point be separately conceptualized. There may be a great many concretes which there is no cognitive point in handling in terms of a single concept. There may be concretes which are not so fundamentally similar to some earlier conceptualized group that it's mandatory to subsume them under an old concept. And these concretes may not be sufficiently widespread and or of sufficient cognitive importance for us to have to conceptualize them separately at all. If you then ask me, but what class do such concretes fall into? What is their essence? The answer is we have not formed a class in the sense of a single concept with its own definition and essential characteristics for them, and there is no need to. They can be handled descriptively by identifying their relation to the nearest relevant classes. In other words, granted that essences are not intrinsic, it is not the case that there must be a single concept to cover every concrete we encounter. There are certain cases where the procedure is optional, where you can either subsume a phenomenon under an old concept, or form a new one, or merely handle a phenomenon descriptively. Now, of course, the question at once comes up, doesn't the existence of optional cases mean that concept formation in these cases is subjective, is arbitrary? To which the answer is no, it does not. Now, note the following facts here. To begin with, the cases where it's optional are dictated by the facts. It is the actual nature of the concretes in question which determines that it is optional, in their case, how to treat them. A new concrete must be neither crucially different nor crucially similar to the concretes already encountered. if you are to have an option whether or not to include it under an earlier formed concept. And if it is crucially different, one cannot include it under the old concept. If it is crucially similar, one must so include it. Note also this. Precisely because these borderline optional concretes are not, in fact, crucially similar to or different from those already known, the alternative modes of handling the new concretes are all correct, and it makes no difference which policy is adopted in a particular case. For instance, if you put the hanging tables into the old class of tables, this would imply that there are some significant similarities between the hangers and the tables. And that's true, there are. Or, if you form a new concept for the hangers, this would imply that there are some significant differences from the tables. And this is true, there are. Or, if you do neither and form no single concept for them, handling them merely in a descriptive phrase, this would imply that neither the similarities nor the differences are overriding. And this is also true. Consequently, all three choices are in accordance with fact, none contradict the others, and in some there is no foothold for subjectivism to enter on this point. Now you can note in this connection that different languages often manifest the fact that there is an optional area in concept formation. And yet this in no way implies subjectivism or contradiction from one language to another. Most keywords are simply translatable in a single word from one language to another. But most languages have certain words which are not simply translatable by one word in other tongues. These words are still, of course, translatable. Only in another language the translation may take a phrase or even more to communicate the phenomenon identified in the first language by one concept, in one word. And this is simply a case where one language handles conceptually what another handles descriptively. And you see that neither language is wrong. Neither contradicts the others. Each is translatable into the others. The principle is the same when applied to borderline case examples. No one option in those cases contradicts the others. Each is legitimate and valid, and there is nothing in this to warrant a subjectivist conclusion. Now let me give you an analogy here. Merely an analogy. But you may find it helpful in grasping the objectivist approach to optional cases as against the intrinsic and the subjectivist viewpoint. And it's only an analogy, but still. Suppose you have a stack of books to classify on library shelves. Now the intrinsicist would say, in effect, the correct order of these books on the shelf is dictated exclusively by the intrinsic character of the books. For instance, I intuit that they must be alphabetized by author. And if you say to him, well, couldn't it be by subject or by title? His answer is only no. I've had the intuition. The intrinsic factor here is X. That's what must dictate the organization. Now the nominalist comes in, the subjectivist. And his viewpoint is any method of arranging them is as good as any other. Decide by your arbitrary whim or take a poll of society. Put the red books on one shelf and stick in some tomatoes if you want. Put the smooth books in front with Kleenex and so on. Now the objectivist objective approach, in contrast, saying that essences are neither intrinsic nor subjective, holds, using the same analogy. You would have to keep in mind two things: the purpose of the classification and the nature of the material to be classified. In other words, the conscious purpose and the facts. And given these, certain arrangements will be nonsensical and invalid. But in certain circumstances, there may be an option. Perhaps in a given case, the purpose is served equally if it's alphabetized by author or by title. You see the analogy. The cognitive purpose of conceptualization and the factual nature of the concretes in question jointly determine when to conceptualize and when there is an area of optionality. Now, in a word, to apply this discussion very briefly to the example of orange and red. Now, here we are dealing with a literal continuum, so no exact cutoff point is dictated by reality as the line of demarcation. Consequently, a certain range is left optional. If you would decide for some purpose to draw a line, then within certain limits it would make no cognitive difference where the line was drawn. And that is a fact of reality, that the exact point makes no difference, and that there is a limited range where it's optional. Notice, however, that no specific line needs to be drawn. You can very well handle the intermediate shades descriptively, without trying to apportion them either to red or to orange. You can merely describe, quote, those transitional stage intermediate between red and orange, progressing from a very reddish orange to a very orangey red, unquote. Or you could, as is done by painters, for instance, give every discriminable shade a separate, distinct name. In other words, form a separate concept for every distinguishable shade. All such options exist, and on the grounds we've already discussed, all would be valid, none would contradict the others, none imply subjectivism in concept formation. So to sum up the borderline case issue, the borderline case puzzles and confuses people because they implicitly believe that essences are intrinsic, and consequently they feel there should not be any optional area in concept formation. Then when they find that in certain specific cases there is an option, they swing over to the nominalist axis and are ripe for the subjectivist plucking. Now, the truth is that essences are objective. This accounts for the fact of optional cases without implying any form of subjectivism. On this issue, as on so many others, the false dichotomy of intrinsic versus subjective has wreaked its usual havoc and confusion. So much for borderline cases and for nominalism, at least for this evening. Could you explain the relation of the concept causal primary to the objectivist theory of the law of cause and effect? What are causal primaries causes of? Well, the person who handed this question in to me said he wasn't fully clear, but I think I get what the question is. A causal primary, in this sense, means the ultimate irreducible elements of reality, that out of which everything else is comprised, and that the operation of which produces all derivative effects. So, for instance, we can, to break up matter, macroscopic solid matter, analyze it in terms of molecules, their laws and behavior, molecules in terms of atoms, atoms in terms of electrons, and so on. Now, in the sense I meant it, the energy puff, and you remember that was just a construct, is what you reach at the very end of the line. And from that aspect, by calling it a causal primary, I mean in the analysis of the ingredients of reality, this is the final irreducible you reach, which cannot itself be analyzed in terms of anything more primitive. What is its relation to cause and effect? Well, simply, it's a cause, and the rest of the phenomenon in reality would be its effects. I don't know what other meaning there would be to that particular question. Is it philosophically necessary for causal primaries to exist? I would say yes, on the grounds that there is no infinity, and therefore ultimately reality must consist of something. But please don't ask me what it consists of, because I'm not a physicist. Given your brief statement of meaning, would you regard the concept of God as meaningful or meaningless? In the sense that I think is meant by this question, I regard the concept as meaningful, but invalid in the sense that it designates no entity in reality. You can distinguish between metaphysically meaningful and epistemologically meaningful. A concept is metaphysically meaningful if it designates something actual or possible in reality. On the other hand, if it is devoid of connection to reality, it is to that extent metaphysically without referent, metaphysically meaningless. This does not, however, mean that the term God is in the category of the word gloop, which I just made up and which stands for nothing whatever. When a person talks about the issue of God, I can understand what it is he thinks he is saying about reality and point out What are the contradictions, the problems, the flaws in his reasoning? I could not do that if he simply uttered ish de triddle de tweedle, true or false. And therefore, I think it is you must grant that the term is meaningful in the epistemological sense. That is, that you can grasp what the intention is, but in fact it has no referent in reality. Will you give objectivism's differentiation between and definitions of 1, a concrete, 2, a concretization? Well, yes, I will. A concrete is a metaphysical term. It stands for any particular, any specific individual thing. A concrete man, a concrete wristwatch. Concrete here does not mean made out of cement. It is contrasted with an abstraction. And the philosophic commoner term in the history of philosophy is what is called particular, a particular. That's what objectivism means by a concrete. A concretization is an epistemological process in which, to clarify some theory, you provide a concrete example. You name or identify some concrete which would illustrate or clarify a theory. So, for instance, I just concretized for you the concept of concrete by giving you a particular example, a concrete river, a concrete man. In offering those examples, I am concretizing for you the concept concrete. That's all there is to it. Concretization is the offering of a concrete intellectually to clarify a point. Is the ultimate standard for new concept formation versus inclusion in a group usefulness to further conceptualization? No, I would certainly not say usefulness if you mean that in any pragmatist use of the term. The ultimate standard is, as I tried to indicate, the facts of reality as interpreted according to the method of a conceptual consciousness. And therefore, and the purpose of conceptualization is not to feed on itself. The purpose of conceptualization is not further conceptualization. The purpose of all conceptualization is the grasping of facts of reality. And therefore, you form a new concept or not, according to whether that will, given the facts of reality, objectively promote a knowledge of reality.